The first thing Jonah Mercer noticed was not the woman standing beside the freight wagon. It was his own name on the paper in her hand, Jonah Mercer, written in a sloping black signature he had never made. The woman looked travel-worn, pale from the cold, and too proud to admit she was frightened. "They told me you signed for a wife," she said. Jonah lowered the splitting maul. "Then they lied to both of us." The wagon driver had already turned his team toward the trail, leaving only wheel ruts, a battered trunk, and a stranger in a gray wool coat at the edge of Jonah's yard. Behind them, the first snow of October clung to the high ridges of the Wind River country. In front of them stood a one-room cabin, a barn, 3 haystacks, and the spring that made Jonah's ranch worth fighting over. The woman introduced herself as Ada Rourke. She was 26, the daughter of a printer from a rail town near Cheyenne, and she had spent 4 days traveling north with a marriage settlement folded inside her coat. The document said Jonah had agreed to marry her. It said he had received a $700 dowry, and in language Ada had not understood until she read it for the 10th time on the road, it said Jonah's spring rights would serve as security until the marriage was legally recorded. Jonah had never seen the settlement, he had never received $700, and he had never asked for Ada Rourke. What he had done 6 months earlier was write one lonely letter to a respectable matrimonial office in Denver. He had asked whether they knew a practical woman willing to share a rancher's life. No money changed hands. No name was chosen, no reply ever came. Jonah had burned the carbon copy and tried to forget he had written it. Now a stranger stood in his yard holding a contract built from that private request. Ada watched his face as he read. "If you send me back," she said, "I will understand." Her voice stayed level, but one hand had closed around the handle of her trunk so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Jonah looked toward the trail. The freight wagon was already gone. Town was 12 miles away. Darkness would reach the pass before she did. "You can stay tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we find out who sold us this lie." Ada did not thank him, not immediately. She only nodded once, as if gratitude were too dangerous to spend before she knew the cost. Jonah gave her the cabin and slept in the barn. By sunrise, the temperature had dropped hard enough to freeze the water bucket by the door. They rode to Alder Creek under a white sky. The town clerk, a nervous man named Hollis, studied the settlement and stopped tapping his pencil. Then he closed the office door. "There's a name behind this," he said. "Silas Creed." Creed owned the freight depot, 2 cattle companies, and most of the notes held against small ranches along the North Fork. In 14 months, he had acquired 8 separate spring claims. Every ranch he took gave him another piece of the valley's water. Jonah's spring was the last reliable source above the lower ford. Without it, Creed could not control the whole grazing route. Hollis pointed to a clause buried near the bottom of the paper. If Ada lived on Jonah's property for 30 consecutive days, Jonah's acceptance of the settlement could be presumed. The forged dowry would become a legal debt. If Jonah failed to repay it, Creed could petition against the spring. Ada counted backward. She had already spent 9 days in transit under documents naming Jonah as her intended husband. Whether those days counted would depend on who was willing to lie under oath. Jonah's jaw tightened. "So this was never about finding me a wife." "No," Hollis said. "It was about putting a claim inside your house." Ada turned toward the window. Across the muddy street, a broad-shouldered man in a black coat stood under the mercantile awning, watching the clerk's office. He tipped his hat when she saw him. Jonah knew him by reputation. "Bram Cutter, Silas Creed's collector." Hollis lowered his voice. "Creed will say you accepted her, accepted the dowry, and accepted the lien. If you throw her out, he'll say you broke the settlement. If you keep her, he'll say you ratified it." Ada gave a humorless laugh. "So either way, the paper wins." Jonah folded the contract. Paper only wins when no one makes it prove itself. That was the first time Ada looked at him without fear. They returned to the ranch and began living like 2 people under observation, because they were. Fresh hoofprints appeared above the spring. A gate latch Jonah always wired shut was found open. Twice, riders watched the cabin from the cottonwoods and disappeared when Jonah approached. Ada could have hidden indoors. Instead, she asked where he kept the fence staples. She repaired a broken chicken run, learned which mare bit strangers, and turned a sack of coarse flour and 2 onions into a supper Jonah remembered 3 days later. She did not move like a guest. She moved like someone determined to owe nobody for the space she occupied. At night, Jonah slept in the barn and Ada slept inside with a chair braced under the door. Their conversations came slowly. Ada had set type in her father's print shop since she was 11. She could read backward letters as easily as ordinary ones. She knew how official seals were pressed, how ink pooled in a damaged groove, and how a careless forger repeated the same mistake without realizing it. Her father, Patrick Rourke, had borrowed money from Creed after a boiler failure shut the press for 6 weeks. The debt began at $300. By spring, Creed claimed it was more than $1,000. Then came the offer. Ada would marry a rancher who had already agreed to cover the balance. Her father resisted for one night. The next morning he put her on the freight wagon. "He would not look at me when I left," she said. The fire cracked between them. Jonah wanted to tell her that desperate men sometimes mistook surrender for protection. But his own brother had died after Jonah refused to ride for a doctor during a blizzard. He knew too much about the stories people told themselves after fear made the decision, so he said only, "Whatever your father owed, he had no right to make you the payment." Ada stared into the fire. No, neither did Creed. The days shortened. Trust did not arrive all at once. It gathered in small proofs. Ada left the stronger horse for Jonah when he rode the upper fence. Jonah repaired the cracked lock on her trunk without opening it. She learned he took his coffee black. He learned she sang under her breath when she needed bread and stopped the moment she noticed someone listening. On the 17th day, Ada found a rider's boot print beside the spring box. On the 18th, the diversion gate was jammed with gravel. On the 19th, half the water feeding Jonah's winter pasture vanished into a ditch cut toward Creed's lower range. Jonah and Ada worked until dark, shoveling frozen mud and dragging stones into the illegal channel. They restored the flow just before the temperature dropped. But by morning, 3 calves were down from the cold, and one never stood again. That was when the threat stopped being a paper problem. Creed's men had touched the living center of the ranch. Jonah rode to Alder Creek with the dead calf's ear tag in his pocket and found the sheriff drinking coffee in Creed's depot office. The sheriff listened. Then he asked Jonah whether a rancher who could not guard his own ditch deserved to keep a spring. Jonah understood. There would be no help from the badge. When he returned, Bram Cutter and 2 men were waiting beside the barn. Ada stood on the porch. Cutter held a second document. He said Patrick Rourke had confessed that the settlement was genuine. He said Ada's father had sworn Jonah's signature had been witnessed. He said Creed would collect Ada before sundown, unless Jonah signed the spring transfer voluntarily. Ada read her father's name at the bottom of the confession. For the first time since arriving, her composure broke, not loudly. She simply sat down on the porch step as if her legs had forgotten their work. Cutter smiled. "You see, your own father says it was honest." Jonah stepped between Cutter and the porch. "Leave." Cutter's smile disappeared. "You have 11 days before the settlement ripens. After that, Creed owns your debt. He owns a lie. He owns the sheriff. And men who own the sheriff usually get to decide what a lie is." Jonah's hand remained close to the revolver under his coat, but he did not draw. He knew Cutter wanted a shooting. A dead rancher would settle the spring faster than any clerk could. So Jonah held his ground and gave Cutter nothing but the promise that the next visit would happen in daylight in front of witnesses. Cutter spat into the snow and rode away. That night the barn roof creaked under a new storm. Ada sat at Jonah's table with her father's confession beside the marriage settlement. For an hour she said nothing. Then she moved the lamp closer. She studied the notary seal on the confession. Then the one on the settlement. Her breathing changed. Jonah. He came around the table. Ada traced the edge of the embossed star. One point was flattened. Beside it, the ring carried a thin crescent where the metal had chipped. "My father owned this seal," she said. Jonah looked at her. "Owned?" "It disappeared from the print shop last winter." She placed both pages side by side. The same broken point, the same crescent, the same defect pressed into 2 documents supposedly notarized in different towns by different men. Creed did not just forge the signatures. Ada's eyes hardened. He forged the authority. By dawn, grief had become a plan. They rode to every family along the North Fork that had lost land or water to Creed. Most were afraid to speak. Then Ada showed them the damaged star. A widow named Mrs. Bell brought out the deed that had taken her south pasture. The crescent was there. The Ortega brothers produced a debt note that cost them their hay meadow. The crescent was there. At the Jensen place, an old man unwrapped a spring transfer from oilcloth. The same broken point. By the end of 3 days, Ada had 6 documents carrying the identical damage seal. 6 papers, 3 supposed notaries, 4 different towns, 1 stolen die. Creed had built his valley on the assumption that isolated people would never compare what had been done to them. Ada changed that. She copied every defect by hand. Jonah gathered statements. Hollis risked his position by searching the county register after midnight. He found that 5 of Creed's spring claims had been recorded within 48 hours of one another, all witnessed by men employed at Creed's depot. There was more. Patrick Rourke had never signed the confession. The final line had been printed from movable type, then traced over in ink. Ada recognized 2 damaged letters from her father's shop, a capital R with a split leg and an E that sat lower than the rest of the word. Creed had used the stolen seal and stolen type, but he had not stolen the knowledge of the woman who had spent 15 years setting those letters by hand. For the first time, they had proof that could survive more than one man's denial. They also had 4 days left. A territorial land examiner was due to pass through Lander before winter closed the road. If they reached him, he could freeze the spring transfers before Creed's 30-day claim matured. If they missed him, the next hearing would be in spring. By then, Creed could divert Jonah's water, seize the herd for the false debt, and scatter the witnesses. The night before they planned to leave, someone set fire to Jonah's south haystack. Jonah woke to orange light moving across the cabin wall. He and Ada ran barefoot into the yard. The wind drove sparks toward the barn. For 20 minutes there was no villain, no contract, no future. Only water buckets, wet blankets, terrified horses, smoke so thick they could not see each other from 10 feet away. They saved the barn. They saved 2 stacks. They lost the third. That hay would have carried 42 head through the deepest part of winter. Without it, Jonah would have to sell cattle before January. Creed had finally found the blow that could break the ranch even if the documents failed. At dawn, Jonah stood in the blackened field. Ada came beside him, her face streaked with soot. "You can still send me away," she said. He looked at her. She had said the same thing on the first day, but now the words cost both of them more. "If you go," Jonah said, "Creed still takes the spring. I know, if you stay, he may burn the rest. I know." The wind moved ash across the snow. Jonah took the forged settlement from his coat. For weeks that paper had defined them as debtor and payment, husband and wife, victim and leverage. He tore it once down the middle. Ada caught his wrist. "Not yet." He stopped. She took the halves, matched the seal, and folded them carefully. "We do not destroy the lie before it testifies." Jonah almost laughed. Instead, he looked at her soot-blackened hands and realized that somewhere between the first fence she mended and the fire they fought together, the question had changed. It was no longer why she had come. It was whether he could bear to watch her leave. They rode before sunrise, Jonah, Ada, Hollis, Mrs. Bell, both Ortega brothers, and old Mr. Jensen. 7 riders carrying 6 forged documents, 1 stolen seal pattern, and enough fear to turn back at every mile. Creed's men blocked the lower ford. They did not draw guns. They simply parked 2 freight wagons across the ice and waited. So Ada led the group upstream to an abandoned logging crossing she remembered from the freight route. The water reached the horses' chests. Ice broke against their legs. Mrs. Bell nearly lost her saddle. But by noon, they were on the Lander Road. By dusk, they reached the examiner's lodging house 30 minutes before his coach departed. The hearing took place in the dining room because the courthouse stove had failed. There was no grand jury, no dramatic gallery, only a scarred oak table, wet coats steaming by the wall, and document after document placed under lamplight. Creed arrived an hour later with the sheriff and a lawyer. He called the ranchers confused. He called Ada ungrateful. He called Jonah a lonely man who regretted the bargain he had made. Then the examiner asked Ada to explain the crescent in the seal. She did. He asked why Patrick Rourke's signature carried 2 broken type marks. She explained that too. He asked Hollis about the recording dates. Hollis handed over the register copies. The room became very quiet. Creed's lawyer stopped taking notes. The examiner pressed the marriage settlement beside Mrs. Bell's deed, the Ortega note, and Jensen's transfer. The same defects stared back from every page. 1 stolen tool had created an empire of false consent. By midnight, the examiner froze all 8 of Creed's spring claims. He voided the supposed marriage debt pending criminal review. He ordered the county register sealed and the sheriff removed from any role in the investigation. Creed was not dragged away in chains. Men like him rarely fell in one clean moment, but the water stopped moving toward his name. Over the next 5 months, 6 families regained claims that had been taken through forged paper. More than 2,000 acres returned to the ranchers who worked them. Jonah kept his spring. His herd made it through winter after the valley families shared hay to replace what the fire had taken. And Patrick Rourke, found hiding at a rail camp after fleeing Creed's threats, admitted he had sent Ada away because he believed distance might keep her alive. It did not excuse him. Ada never pretended it did, but it gave her the truth, which was more than Creed had intended anyone to have. Spring came late to the North Fork. The first grass appeared in thin green blades beside the spring box. By then, Ada had been away from Jonah's ranch twice, once to testify, once to bring her father to live with relatives in Denver. Both times the cabin felt wrong without her voice in it. On the morning she returned for good, she found Jonah replacing the burned hay rack. He set down the hammer. Neither of them mentioned the old settlement. That paper was evidence now, locked in a county file. It had no right to decide what came next. Ada stopped a few feet from him. "The examiner says I am free of the contract." Jonah nodded. "So am I." A small uncertainty crossed her face. He had faced fire-armed men, winter water, and a corrupt sheriff with less fear than he felt in that moment. "I do not want a wife delivered by debt," he said. Ada waited. "I want the woman who knew a broken letter could bring down a powerful man." Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. "I want the woman who saved the proof when I was ready to tear it in half." He stepped closer. "And if she chooses another road, I will not stop her." Ada looked past him at the cabin, the barn, the blackened patch where new grass had begun to push through ash. Then she looked back. "I have had enough of roads chosen for me. This one I choose." They married in June beside the spring Creed had tried to steal. Hollis read the vows. Mrs. Bell brought flowers. The Ortega brothers built a long table from fresh-cut pine. No dowry changed hands, no broker stood between them, no debt was hidden under the words. Ada signed her own name, Jonah signed his, and this time both signatures were true. Paper had brought her there, choice kept her.